Buyurun başlayabiliriz, please.
Okay. Hello, everyone. We are here at the panel titled Architecture and Care. My name is Derya Özkan. I work as a researcher and I teach at İzmir University of Economics, based in İzmir. I'm an architect by origin, but then I moved on to visual and cultural studies. And I'm the one who suggested to organize this panel upon invitation of my dear friend Çiçek, who was the coordinator of the events as part of Good Design in İzmir. Thanks, Çiçek, for inviting me. And I suggested to do something on architecture and care. And first I contacted my other dear friend, Elke Krasny, who is based in Vienna. I knew that she has been working on architecture and care for a while. And Elke suggested that we include Marvi as well in this panel. Marvi Mazhar, who is with us today. Hi, Marvi.
Hi, thank you.
And Marvi is an architect, a researcher. She also teaches at the university. She has been especially working on rehabilitation projects that she will tell you more in detail in the following hours of this panel. And she's also collaborating with Elke on a new piece of work. It's a book, right?
And an exhibition, both.
Yeah, a book and an exhibition on a female Pakistani architect, Yasmin Lari. So I met Marvi through this conversation, through Elke. And Elke, unfortunately, is not with us today. Elke told us very recently that she tested COVID positive. And she really had bad symptoms. She felt very unwell. So she couldn't make it to the panel, unfortunately, today. So Marvi and I talked about it and decided that we'll cover for her, and decided on a path to take in the absence of Elke, but trying to cover what Elke has to say about architecture and care as well. So I'll begin the conversation by first talking about what we mean by architecture and care, or architecture as care. I'm going to read first the little synopsis we wrote as a description of this panel. You might have seen or read it in the documents that are about the event, Good Design. And then I'll move on to talk about architecture and care in a more historical fashion. And I'll do that by referring to especially one text by Elke Krasny on architecture and care, in which she covers the history of architecture and the history of Western binary thought, and how architecture has been conceived as something so far away from care. We'll come to that in a second. And then I'll give the word to Marvi, and she's going to talk about architecture as repair. We'll learn from her about some actual implementations of projects that we might count as examples of architecture as care and architecture as repair. And we'll end by talking about a broader notion of ethics of care, ethics as care, in relation to what we talked about earlier. So we plan to take for 45 minutes for our talking, 9 of which is already gone. And then we'll spend 15 minutes at the very end for questions and answers. So we have now 35 more minutes, and I'll start by talking about the little synopsis. I'll just read this little synopsis that we wrote as a description of this panel. In climate catastrophic and pandemic times, the fundamental function of architecture, the provision of essential care, has become more urgent than ever. This urgency allows us to think of architecture as care and architects as care workers for everyday social reproduction. Yet the modern architect has been viewed as an independent genius, traditionally gendered male, and not as a care worker, traditionally feminized and racialized. This panel is an intellectual exercise on how to practice architecture as care. So this was our departure point, and of course we were thinking of our relation to the topic of this event, good design, which is focusing on a concept which is vital this year. We're talking about architecture and care in terms of architecture in a very broader sense, providing shelter for human beings and being kind of like indispensable to human life in that sense. So architecture being vital for humans and non-humans. And we'll come to the non-human life as well. We'll talk about how it has actually, the scope of architecture has very much been in the discourse of architecture, especially limited to the human life. We will open that up to non-human life as well. So we will talk about mainly architecture with a capital A and the history of it, and care with a not a capital, a small c. So I'll explain in a minute what I mean by that, but architecture with a capital A and care with a small c. So in the text that I mentioned, Architecture and Care is the title of the text. Elke talks about, gives a very neat, very compact overview of the history of architecture, how architecture has come to be what it is today, how we, in a very broad sense, imagine architecture. What do we understand when we say architecture? Which is the answer that Elke gives to that question is architecture as made up of star architects, all these fancy buildings, part of urban development, designing buildings that look beautiful, that kind of a persona, which basically is this independent, supposedly independent being, a genius creator, who does this kind of like work that requires kind of high-level skills and all that. So this is what we came to understand when we talk about architecture, and that has a history. So architecture with a capital A is mainly architecture that has developed as something that goes outside of what we mean by architecture and care, goes outside of the notion of an architect as a carer, which we will argue for, but more to the direction of the idea of the architect as an autonomous, independent genius, not disconnected from kind of realities of life, the material realities that a lot of people suffer from. And we'll come to that suffering as well. So here, as I mentioned earlier, we are trying to overcome the idea of architecture with a capital A and suggest something that we call architecture as care with a small a, that is concerned not only with the survival of human beings, serves the human needs for shelter, but broadens up that perspective to include the needs of non-humans, the needs of the environment, the needs of nature, which is becoming increasingly, as we all know, problematic these days. I mean, I don't know, like when I say these days, to how long we have been talking about these things, but what I mean is basically natural environmental catastrophe, pandemic, the age of the pandemics, climate change, floodings and all that, that is already happening in the world. So we all know that the planet has gone wrong. And now, especially during the time of the pandemic, when COVID started, people started realizing and noticing these things, although they were already there. So I'm going to give a very quick overview of what Elke talks about in terms of the history of the architect and history of architecture in Western binary thought. And I'll talk about three major canonical moments, Elke calls it. I know I'm beyond time, but I'll try to wrap it up in like 4 minutes. Is that okay, Marvi?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So Marvi talks about in this text about three canonical moments in which architectural discourse, as we know it today, took shape. The first one is the moment of Vitruvius. Architects and perhaps other designers would know this name. And 10 books on architecture that Vitruvius has written in 30 BC, in which he does something interesting. He talks about architecture as something different from nature. So he distinguishes between nature as a natural source of building shelters and architecture as a culture that is different from that. So that's the first moment that Elke talks about. The second moment Elke talks about is the 15th century. It's basically the Renaissance, when Alberti wrote his on the art of building in 10 books, the famous treatise that everybody knows about, where he talks about the divide between craftsmanship and architecture, and takes what Vitruvius has said one step further, making this distinction an important one in his own way. And he thinks that it's different when we talk about learned skills and creative genius, which is like local knowledge and the architects learned knowledge, which is, of course, there's a hierarchical relationship between these binary, the sides of the binary here. He talks about dependence, independence. Independence is better than dependence. Or learned skill, creative genius. Creative genius is better than higher status, has a higher status than learned skill. This kind of thing. So the architect and the craftsman are not equals. The architect is has a higher status, knows better, basically. So that was the second moment, and the third moment is the age of enlightenment, of course, where a lot of things changed when the first architecture school opened in Paris, École Polytechnique, the first school for modern architecture, which, not surprisingly, did not admit females for architectural education. So it opened, I'm repeating, in 1794, and I did not admit women to architecture school until 1970, when there was a new law in France which allowed women to register to the architecture school. So this gives us an idea about the gendered division of the idea of the gendered nature of the idea of the architects. We are here talking about these moments, and I don't have time, unfortunately, to go deeper into it, but perhaps we can open it up when you ask questions later. Later on in this text, we learn from Anke that there are the women becoming part of the practice of architecture, stayed as a problem, as a trouble, which she calls care trouble, for a long time. And what we need is a new notion of architecture, basically, that tries to understand architecture differently, different from what we have learned so far. So a suggestion to unlearn what we have learned in schools of architecture, which again, we will come back at the very end when we talk about ethics of care. So we want to unsettle this architecture care divide, and we want to suggest that architecture as care is something that can be practiced today, that actually is the need today, is what we need today. It is so urgent, it is so obvious, more than ever, especially in the age of climate change, environmental catastrophes, ongoing in the world. So that takes us to a topic that I mentioned at the very beginning, which is architecture and care together with architecture as repair. And now I'll stop here and kindly ask Marvi to talk about that a little bit. Marvi?
Thank you so much, Daria, for setting the tone and setting the background, how we are going to start our conversation. I mean, the book is absolutely very, very important. It has some very critical queries and inquiries, especially when we talk about moving from the 3 points that you mentioned, and then moving towards the idea of repair, which is a very important junction in my own work and the kind of spatial advocacy I do in Karachi, and which is based out of Pakistan. And I'm going to read out certain parts from my own work. But before I go towards that, I would like to share an image which kind of takes us towards on the idea of repair. Can you see this image?
Yes.
Okay. So this image came out in Wall Street Journal in the month of end of I would say August, after Pakistan went through massive flood and rain, which was very unusual for this year. And historically speaking, the last major flooding that took place was in 2015, and before that it was 2011. So looking at the timeline, this image is pretty, talks about the submerging and the architecture near the liquid grounds, the soft grounds around and in the water, Indus River, which flows from north to south and then meets the coast on the south where Karachi is. So on the general speaking right now, this is the condition for last 3 months, and the water has only gone down till 3 feet, where people are still suffering on many levels, not just architecturally or built environment, losing their spaces, but also hygiene, health, and post understanding of what's going to happen next. So here the idea of care and repair kind of make a whole lot sense. So when we talk about repair, and especially what LK talks about in her section, she brings out this idea. She talks about this alliance in the work. And in this alliance, she talks about bringing together grassroots organizations, civil society actors, architects, partners from the city administration. And also in the future, the complex will include affordable housing, cultural education facilities, as well as government infrastructure. So when you bring these alliances together, you kind of think about the repairing. We're always talking about development, and especially in the global South and South Asian cities, we're always talking about generating a new skyline. And that skyline is always competing with the international standards. But here in my work, I'm talking about taking forward from what LK talks about alliance. I'm going to read out, looking at this photograph, and you keep this photograph as part of the, as a background. And I'll say that since last 4 years, I've been advocating against unethical coastal development schemes and urban infrastructure on reclaimed land. Most of these projects have top-down decisions by the state, often proceeding without environmental impact assessments or community engagement. This unethical practice has now extended from urban to rural zones, converting agricultural lands, natural causeways, or areas immediately adjacent to grid-based sectors for housing projects or for commercial purposes, including tourism. Global warming has led to coastal lands and villages along the riverbanks in Pakistan becoming submerged, Sindh being worst hit. In the aftermath of the devastating floods, it is all more urgent to consider ecology in the rehabilitation phase. This is a wide range of geographies and terrains along the Indus River, and external internal funding agencies, architects, and developers must work with local community knowledge so that the environmental justice and social regional contexts is reflected in the outcome. So here we are talking about architects working with the community, with the people, so that the local knowledge becomes part of the top-down knowledge. In conversation with architects and NGOs after the 2005 earthquake and 2010 floods, what emerged most strongly was a fractured disaster rehabilitation management, whereby alien, unfamiliar construction material was distributed to remote villages of Pakistan. For example, steel girders and galvanized iron sheets were distributed as rehabilitation construction packages with IKEA-style construction instructions on how to put materials together to make prefab development. But how do we build back better is the question. And that's the question the architects are constantly asking in the realm of the disaster. What was missing in these industrial level giveaways was how to build back safely in the specific region, ethically and ecologically. Prefabricated village models are not the way forward. In fact, introducing industrialized systems into remote region is not sustainable. Public environmental pedagogy involves research-based sustainable rehabilitation, infrastructure for specific region, terrain, flood zones. And here, again, the architect asks the question, the plinth and the roof are considered critical design elements that can safeguard families from rising water levels. On the other hand, in earthquake-prone areas, seismic architecture is implemented. So these kind of queries are very, very critical now when we think about repairing, when we think about aftermaths of a disaster. The handmade methods involve local people working on a model of sustainable and modern architecture in a dynamic process, which has been successful on a lab and experimental level. So all these handmade construction has never gotten that kind of exposure or that kind of large viewership or administration that it becomes part of daily architecture built methods. It's only used as a case study or a laboratory methodology. So here in my work, I'm pushing that this kind of rehabilitation where these lab case studies become everyday architecture and the repairing is learned from them. The concept of architecture and ecological care has hardly been applied in a context, especially in academic institutes where design practices are geared towards preparing star architects for selling competitive skyline structures, as I mentioned before. The floods in Pakistan are a time of reckoning. From my practice in spatial thinking, we have to think now about how each year more and more agricultural land is lost to residential development. I believe that if we use it wisely, architecture has a potential to contribute significantly to restoration and repairing of ecological balance in this country. Thanks, Ariane.
Thank you, Marvi. I guess in Pakistan and all over the world. So, I mean,
it's a very critical junction right now, talking about rupture, talking about this kind of decay, especially in countries, South Asia, which is underdeveloped and needs different kind of mechanism, which is more regional, which is more local, than thinking of competition and becoming star cities is something that now it needs, how you said, unlearning. Now it needs another phase, which is relearning and rethinking with the community, with the society of the locality.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you. We can perhaps move on to the ethics as care part, as I mentioned earlier, and talk about more about what we suggest, what we think of the role of the architect to be in the context that we kind of summarized, and what architectural education perhaps needs to be like, needs to revise itself into. And the architect, the figure of the architect, the professional, what kind of a role that may take under these conditions. I mean, the moments that Elke was talking about was pointing to the shaping of the role of the architect. And as we said, it was very much a role that was assigned to the architect, which is different. There was always an attempt to distinguish it from local knowledge, distinguish it from craftsmanship, make it a more specialized kind of practice, and not talk about the architect as we would suggest as mediator, but more like the genius creator. So that's what we are criticizing here, I guess, like our critical approach to the understanding of architecture and the understanding of the architect as a professional is that architect shouldn't be so much as the genius creator, the one who is building all those fancy high rises, but the role that we need right now, and especially in the midst of crisis our world is in, is more like a mediator, like using the knowledge that the architect has to mediate between local knowledge and more specialized knowledge. Not perhaps like a top-down kind of like determine everything for people, do something for the people, but do something with the people. That's what I guess we are suggesting, right, Marvi?
Absolutely, Divya. I mean, it is super important that the architect now becomes the bridge rather than becoming a singular, isolated form of thinking in a studio. It is very important to now think about site analysis versus field notes and taking field knowledge as part of the site understanding. Generally speaking, I mean, I would highlight here as a school that, you know, in our context, are developing the same methodology of what is an architect, a godlike figure that is nurtured to develop something which is unique. And this idea of uniqueness is something that we need to now critically talk about, that is it the unique or one-off versus adopting knowledge and learning with the surrounding, with the environment, with human, non-human, and looking at how those factors can be incorporated as part of design mechanism. So alliance becomes very important. And here I'll read a section from LK's paragraph here, where she talks about care for skills, local knowledge traditions found in crafts, and heritage restoration work are activated for buildings that are ecologically responsive to specific weather conditions and climate needs, resourcefully putting to use a minimum of financial means and advancing skills for local economies, including self-help, self-building economies. These examples cut through the toxic cycles of globalized aid dependency. So, I mean, this is a very critical point of junction here, that she's talking about self-dependent, like you need to be independent. And in that independency, you don't need that kind of external collection of data. So an architect, when he builds with the people, you're passing on the knowledge. So the both factors learn from each other.
Right. Yeah, I guess this concept of independence needs to be replaced. That's what we are saying. Needs to be replaced with interdependence, right? In the Western thought, let's say the mainstream Western thought, it has always been based on this idea of the independent subject, which has been criticized, of course, like it has been criticized for a long time, in especially post-colonial thinking, in feminist thinking. So there's this point in which we need to understand that being independent is not the ideal. We have to admit that we are interdependent. And interdependent is the key to solving the problems, like staying independent and thinking that like we are totally kind of like these people with great ideas, independent of anything, does not really make sense any longer. I guess like that's the kind of turning point to talk about interdependence and learning from each other, learning together, doing together, rather than being independent, being autonomous, being genius, being this and that. So not a very top-down approach, but a more horizontal approach where architects work together with people, learn from them, and then do something together with them, or perhaps just let them do it, right?
And Virya, this also leads up to a very important social question here, that when we are learning from each other and we are developing it in that horizontality that you just explained, if that develops into society, if that depends into social thinking and social living, rather than taking up the idea of grid-based architecture, which we thought is a suburban architecture adapted from the American systems of like Western thinking, of this is how gated communities and isolated living is produced in that top-down decision. But when you are working in a community, a society is built. And that is a more social sense. And that's we learned in COVID times. And when we got that isolation and a lockdown, the only thing that one really missed was interaction and that conversation. And then the whole, I mean, at least in South Asia, people started cleaning up their balconies and their rooftops to kind of get that outdoor space approach, right? But what about the poor housing, which did not have those public spaces or those tertiary spaces, those third spaces? And that's when you think about that, how come in formal settlement, no one designed that kind of tertiary spaces or those third spaces? So these queries only comes when there is like a large catastrophe or a disaster. And right now in floods, we are talking about that what is an ethical architecture? What is the architecture which kind of sustains the floods or the disaster, but also the people themselves make it and learn from the local material rather than industrialized and galvanized materials. So I think it's a responsibility of an architect to bring that kind of a conversation within the community so they can be interdependent, as you mentioned.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I would like to refer back to the Architecture and Care text by Elke, the link of which I shared with everyone in the chat box. It's available online on her academia account. I'd like to read a passage from here, and then it's again about the dependence-independence thing, and say a few things that also connects us to how this work, let's say the ongoing intellectual work, to think of things differently, like to think architecture differently, to think architecture as care, has so many different dimensions and so kind of like fundamental questions in history, in terms of, especially as Elke explains very, very nicely in her text, in terms of gender and race, that really, let's say, provides a lot of evidence that we really need to change it. So I'm going to read this passage, and then after I read it, I'll say a few more things. Independence, this glorified idea in the history of Western consciousness, is linked to the intellectual and creative capacities of the genius. Liberated from the restrictions of the vocational world, governed by the economy of rules, with the guilds controlling access and guarding knowledge, the genius is also freed from the obligations of the mundane drudgery of reproductive labor, taken care of in the household, usually by wives and servants. So when we say by wives, you understand my gender point, and the servants are the racialized people who do reproductive labor for the genius. So the ideology of independence relevant to the politics of modern subject formation strategically obscured and rendered invisible the system of reproduction in place behind autonomy. So this provides evidence that the genius, let's say, the proclaimed genius also needs reproduction work, but the proclaimed genius doesn't do the reproduction work, but has the woman and the racialized other do it for them. So there is this question of race and gender behind all thinking behind the independent genius architect. So, right. So she goes on saying we owe a lot to feminist thinking in this sense, and post-colonial thinking in terms of understanding why care ethics has to do with connectedness and interdependency rather than independency and autonomy. Anything else, Marvi, you wanted to add?
No, I'm okay. I mean, we can open to the public, and
okay,
if they want to take any questions.
Okay, are there any questions? I don't see any in the Drive document. Çiçek? Çiçek, can you hear me? Or if anybody else wants to. Hi, Çiçek.
Hi. We don't have any question from the hall, actually, any addition.
Mm-hmm. Anybody from here who wants to ask a question? We have 15 more minutes, so. I wish you had some questions.
I think we are like the fourth session here with them. So they must be like super tired.
Possible. Yeah.
Actually, I have a question.
Okay, great.
What do you see as the most or the strongest? What do you see as the strongest obstacle or barrier between this idea of independence in architecture, interdependence of architecture in means of social thinking and living, and the current situation? How could it be made possible? I'm not looking for any formulas, of course. It is not easy to find in a word. It wouldn't be good to find it in one sentence or in 1 second or in one question. I'm aware of it, but maybe to put some seeds on the road to open the way of social thinking and living in means of architecture and care and interdependence.
Marvi, you want to start? Or?
So, yeah, I mean, just to start off with that, this is almost like, like unpacking the whole theory of what it means to become an architect. So it's like prehistoric. It has to be unlearned and understood from that grassroots level, like where the problem is emerging. And then we need to also look into the universities that the kind of knowledge has been passed on or is being trained. So the training program, the undergraduate programs, that needs to be looked into critically. So those are the two aspects that I feel like it is a passed on knowledge, and also how to kind of like, I mean, again, it can't be formulated into a sentence. It needs more roundtables to think about what an architect needs to be of the future. But it's a whole kind of like erasing or like rethinking with with community, with academics, with practitioners, with municipality, with the city. All of them need to come together to think about that architect that needs to represent and to think on behalf. Daria, you please add on what you think.
Thank you. I totally agree with Marvi that it really has to do with redefining the role of the architect, and the schools of architecture have a big role to play here. I studied architecture myself. I went to the Middle East Technical University, known as like the best architecture school in Turkey. I mean, I was a person who was reading and thinking a lot about architecture, which made me kind of, I can say in my third year in architecture, made me ask a lot of questions about the nature of architecture, and I stopped practicing it after all. But among the things I have seen and experienced were how architectural education actually give this professional ideology to the students. So what we know about the architect, the modern architect, as genius, as independent, as creator, as this artist, whatnot, totally comes from the notion of architecture that we get at architecture schools. Of course, that is linked to the history of it. You can link it all the way back to modernist architecture, Bauhaus, and then back, as Elke does in this text, all the way back to Vitruvius. But this is such a strong thing that is still very much in place. So, I mean, I have witnessed people who were not even aware what they were going to study when they first arrived in the School of Architecture in the first year. And I saw how they transformed themselves and their thinking into architects and architects kind of thinking. Like, it's not only they fashioned themselves as architects. So it's a role that you take on, that you learn actually. And since architects are educated at universities, and the knowledge we get from universities, of course, like as students, all of us, we just learn and take it over, right? I mean, it is transferred kind of knowledge, and we find ourselves reproducing the same ideology when we become architects. So I think architectural schools are really, they have a big role here. So architecture schools, rather than teaching students that they will become star architects one day and build one of those skyscrapers in New York City, which is the goal, kind of, that should not be the ideal. Architectural schools, in that sense, need to change their curricula, I guess, right? The curriculum is totally geared towards that design genius, that creator, that creation, that's like the unique thing that the architect will create and nobody else can. That kind of thinking. So maybe like when I say the curriculum in schools of architecture need to be revised, it needs to be revised in the direction of being more realistic, looking at the, let's say, political economy of things at the beginning, how the market in which the architect operates, how the market works, the building market, the market for architectural development, the market for land uses, perhaps that, plus in a direction that would allow to question the status of the profession, like the status of the profession as this kind of like a deified, having this deified status. That needs to be challenged and reversed, I guess, right? Architects need to be educated in a more modest fashion. Architects need to learn to be modest, not as those like people who know everything, which is the case. I think like a lot of people who study architecture in my environment, at least, but I know it from the world as well, they do all kinds of different things after they graduate. And part of why this happens is that architecture students are taught that they could do anything. They are these like really, like they are gods who can design anything, and they have this power, right? So these notions need to be really destroyed, let's say, and build up a new, to be able to be more realistic and more constructive and aware of the age we live in, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question, Çiçek. Is that?
Sure, thank you very much.
Any other questions? I guess you can ask questions in Turkish as well. We can translate it if you want to ask in Turkish if it's easier, more comfortable? No? Çiçek, if there are no other questions, what shall we do? Anything else to kind of wrap up the whole thing? Or shall we just close here?
We can conclude it now, I think, if there are no questions.
Okay.
If you want to add some more things, we would be happy to hear it. Otherwise, actually, we have a hand on Zoom.
A question?
Yeah, someone has raised hand.
Okay.
Yes, we will let her to unmute herself.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, I practiced architecture in professional firms, and at the moment I'm teaching. And I want to ask you, I want to talk in simpler words because some other people will also, besides this profession, will listen. But to make the right decisions in life and to think the good wellness of humankind, incredible amount of loneliness is needed. Incredible amount of loneliness, meditation, thinking straight, because in this madness, an architect also, if he or she wants to practice the good side of it, not the dark side, and I don't agree with some skyscrapers are not all ill-intended. Like there are very wellness-oriented skyscrapers also. So my question is, I just don't want to be pessimistic, but it looks like the dark side is winning, and that's why an architect is not able to choose the goodness, wellness side of loneliness. Like, because if he or she chooses that, that leads to working together with people. That leads to asking them how they are doing. That leads to this architect to say, hold on a second, I don't agree with you, boss. I don't care if you are giving me millions of dollars. And like in the movies, I know I'm talking a little romantic, but he or she puts his hand on the table and says, you know what? I don't care. I care for people. I don't care about your money. Take your money. I'm gonna draw even my 10 centimeters correctly for the goodness of humankind. So my question is, like, for example, Glenn Murcutt, he's very lonely. He's a one-star architect, but he always chose the good side of it. Like, he's producing really good designs. So that my question to Marvi, is it because of the geographical luck? For example, Glenn Murcutt, like, why he's a star, but he's a very modest star, but they are so a few in numbers. Like, we don't have that type of architect so much. Usually, like Derya Hocam said, most of the architects are çok havalı. They are like so, like they look at people from above, and like they have big egos, we have big egos, and usually the bad side, dark side is winning. So that's my question to Marv. What do you think about Glenn Murcutt type of architects, like who wants to do good, who wants to produce wellness for humankind?
Thank you so much for your question. I'll try to respond to it if I understood it right. But here you see the good side or the ethical side. Let's say the ethical side. Let's not say good side, but let's say the ethical side becomes the minority versus what the real estate value of today's time becomes the other side. So real estate and construction, generating mechanisms and money and job opportunities are all on the other side. But if we think in our parameters and not compete on the global level, and we look at what our region is able to produce, and we look at that kind of, see, the globalization has brought a lot of rupturedness, right? So you are always wanting more. But if we say that what your region is creating and producing, and if we are part of that dialogue and we kind of become, and we accept what is being produced and given to us and not go towards absolute competition, then that might help in creating from minority to majority. And the other thing is very important here, without policies, without state intervention, you will always become the minority then. So it is very important that the regulations and laws are implemented in developing that ethical architect. I understand that the entire global market calls for that big name and big firms and big architects and big production. The drawings are produced in somewhere else and the implementation takes place in somewhere else. For example, a lot of Middle East architecture is coming from international architects who are working, who have not even visited the region, and they're producing these skylines as a competition, as a matter of landmarks and monuments, and that leads up to arrival, bringing more tourism in that way, that these monuments and landmarks are going to bring people towards them. But is it now the time to talk about ethical practice? Is what it is now important to bring that as part of conversation. And that cannot take place if the state and the government is not part of that dialogue and brings it as a regulations, as part of, and architecture itself has associations. So like in our region, we have this body called PCATP, which is the Pakistan Council of Town Architects and Planners, where we register ourselves. If that institute doesn't hold some kind of vision, which is for the future, we will never be able to move forward that way. Then we will only be minority and talking like in this academic institutional matters. We will never be able to practice that ideology of ethical practices.
I guess there is another hand raised. Maybe changed their minds. Anybody else who wants to ask a question? Okay.
Okay. Thank
Çiçek?
you. Yeah.
Then we say thank you to everyone who participated. Thanks for coming. At the end of the day, it's now 6 here. It's 8 actually in Marvi's time. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for the Vital team for putting up this incredible conference and for inviting. Deria, you were very kind enough to hold a couple of meetings with me. I wish Elke was here and we would have made it into more, opened up many venues, because the exciting work and the writings that she does constantly are very, very important. And Deria, thank you for moderating and bringing up the relevant questions, and the audience for listening to us and being patient enough for this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you too for all the things you said. And thanks Çiçek for asking us to do this, for helping us with the logistics. And I wish this results in further collaboration and we meet again.
Thank you. Take care.
Actually, I would like to say thank you in person, although I wrote it on the chat box. It was a very mind-opening talk with you, and I think what you shared with us was a very serious, strong, and strongly related with the realities of the world, and vitalism and architecture. We should digest it and develop some questions afterwards to make the discussion to develop the discussion deeper. Thank you very much, Marvi and Darya.
Thank you, Shikha. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a good night. Bye-bye.